Thanks, Mr. President, for allowing us for the opportunity to speak to you. We're here in Salaam, and I thought because the news of Umama Gertrude Shope arrived when we were here, we could take this opportunity to request your tribute, your thoughts about her magnanimous life, which covers some of these areas that have been in conversation throughout this week on our stay here.
Yes, no, it was. It really came across as very sad news. While indeed, as you say, while we're in Dar es Salaam here, that Megeti had passed away. But of course, I'd seen her in Gaborone about a year ago. We were in Gaborone for some funeral, but I did see her. And in a sense, one should have expected that this would happen. Because this generation that were passing away at the age of 99. As a particular generation of our struggle, she belongs to a very distinguished generation of leaders of our people. Megeti, she as leader of the Women's League and the leader of the ANC, both at home and internationally. And she was, in terms of the women's international democratic movement, recognized there as one of the leaders in the global women's progressive movement, apart from leadership at home. And these are the people who made sure that you develop a very powerful women's voice for the liberation of our people. And that women's voice remains to this day, and I think in a very visible, very audible. And then Megeti Gertrude Shope was, as president of Women's League for many decades, member and then president, a very important player in terms of developing that capacity among our women. Level of confidence, level of clarity about the issues, not only gender issues, but the national issues about the liberation of the country. So we lose somebody who is really a store for a lot of experience. Embodied a lot of what the movement did. It's been involved in our struggles for decades. I'm saying it was a loss. But of course, this is a person who's 99 years old. None of us live forever.
100 years.
Yes, almost 100 years. It's a loss. I do hope that when we say farewell to her, when we lay her to rest, it will be a dignified funeral, which pays tribute to somebody who was really of very great value to our country.
I'd like to congratulate you, Mr. President, then about the 15th session of the Thabo Mbeki Africa Day lecture. 15 years is a very long time. It's actually longer than you were in government in South Africa.
Yeah, I know.
And you have done, together as a foundation, a quite remarkable work that I don't think is matched in the continent with regards to foundations of that nature. Intellectual contribution, policy, well-researched, actual books, and the big project of the Presidential Library. I thought as a point of departure to request you to reflect of what these 15 years mean. I'm sure many people have many thoughts about it, but to have been able to do all this work, I'm saying that 15 years is of the Africa Day lecture, but it also marks this long, over a decade years of the foundation itself. If you were to reflect about it, what are the key sort of moments for you in these 15 years?
Well, to start with the Africa matter, I think you got to bear in mind that in terms of the struggle, we grew up in a Pan-Africanist atmosphere, even as we were young in the ANC Youth League. I mean, remember, for instance, when Lumumba was killed in the Congo. So we, first of all, removed from government, later killed. We participated in demonstrations in Johannesburg in support of Patrice Lumumba. It was an obligation, I mean, as part of Pan-Africanist obligation to express that kind of solidarity. So that's how we grew up. We grew up very conscious of the Pan-Africanist origins, even of the ANC, long before the ANC was established in the 19th century. The poets, African intelligentsia were the major meeting at the time. We're talking about Africa, including the African diaspora. So really, that's how we grow up. So then, of course, we end up in exile, which really reinforced that. So for many decades, we've always worked in an African context. So the matter, for instance, that arose about the Africa Day lectures, at the foundation we said, it really is part of our being as a foundation to honor Africa Day. That we're not just a South African foundation. The African continent is important. So Africa Day, we must honor Africa Day by hosting an Africa Day lecture on African challenges, what are the challenges of the day and what should be done. So this is what we've been doing for 15 years. And of course also right at the time of the foundation, at its foundation, of the foundation, you had people from Senegal, people from Ghana, the people from here, people from Mozambique who attended the launch and made a point then that this Thabo Mbeki Foundation, we must understand that it's not a South African foundation, but an African foundation. Therefore, in terms of its programs, it has to focus on the African challenges, not just South African. And so that's how, in that context, people then started complaining when the succession of Africa Day lectures were held only in South Africa, to say this is not right. And as you know, we then agreed we must rotate.
Yes.
And we rotated first to Guinea, Conakry. And part of the reason for that is that, the Guinea is under Sékou Touré, had a particular history in this sense, that the liberation of South Africa, that topic, the liberation of South Africa, was a school subject and a university subject. So the Guineans knew everything that needs to be known about the struggle in South Africa. ANC, everything. I went to Guinea when the late President Conte was president, a former general. So I'm president of South Africa, I went there. And he made a very painful comment. And he said to me, President, we in Guinea, thanks to Sékou Touré's leadership, the South African struggle was our struggle. The ANC, we know everything about the ANC, this and that and the other. But all of you, starting with Nelson Mandela, you always overflow Guinea. You came to West Africa, but you'd always overflow Guinea. Never stepped foot. You are the first one to do that. We were there with the then foreign minister, our foreign minister, was Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma. So she then decides on one period to take a window shopping thing, the streets of Conakry, and gets into a jewelry, looks around, and so the shopkeeper asks her, "Are you not the South African foreign minister?" So she says, "Yes, I am." And then he says to her, in terms of looking around, he says, "Which one do you do you think really you think is the best? Peace. So she said, no, this one. But she wasn't buying anything. She was just window shopping. So he took it off, wrapped it up, and gave it to her. So she said, no, I'm not buying. She says, I'm not selling. You are the foreign minister of South Africa. You walk into my shop. ANC, this is your gift from the people of Guinea. That's why we thought, no, let's go to Guinea first. Really to fulfill a promise. We should have been there. The complaint that was made by President Conte that you people would just overfly Guinea all the time. So we are in Tanzania for the second time. This is the second outing on the continent. Of course, this one is easy. This is the home of the liberation struggle right throughout Southern Africa. So it's very easy to come here. But I'm just saying, Mbuyiseni, that it's really part of an old ANC tradition of Pan-Africanism, of a very deep-seated connection to the rest of the continent. So I'm very glad that as a foundation it is possible to do that. And I'm also very glad you could see it in Guinea, you could see it here in Tanzania, that the people here appreciate this very much, that we come to their countries to... and indeed, I know that there are a number of other countries on the continent who've already said, but when are you coming to us? I think that reinforces the need for African unity, African solidarity, acting together so that we confront these African challenges and try and find solutions to all of them. I'm glad the foundation is playing a role in that respect. But more generally, we've said from the beginning that the foundation must be committed to this renaissance of the continent, which naturally means also the renaissance of South Africa. And so one of these major issues which arose before the foundation was established, we thought that it was important for us to capture the history of struggle. How did democracy come about? How was it born? So that the actors themselves, the participants, the people who played the role must talk about this. And not allow a situation where only observers write this history from what they've observed. But, so that is why this South African Democratic Education Trust was set up. And at a certain point, they then came over and to become part of the foundation family. That's a very important project to cover this history, how democracy in South Africa was born, which therefore also includes not only the struggles in South Africa, but the struggles in the world against apartheid and so on. The contribution of Tanzania, of Cuba, of Brazil, of India, of Russia, everybody, to tell that particular story. And we've taken a decision some time back that we need to find a way of preparing those histories, prepare textbooks that would be suitable for high school students. Because there's this huge volume of knowledge about what's happened. But in a sense, it's inaccessible. It's there. You can look at all these books, but so you need to make the necessary preparations to prepare these books for accessibility in terms of younger people. That's a project that we must still carry out. And I think that's again, very important because I'm sure even while we've been here in Tanzania for a few days, I've had some of the Tanzanian leadership making an observation about the youth of Tanzania, that even the youth of Tanzania are forgetting whatever happened here which brought independence to Tanganyika and then Tanzania and all that this history is not known, but by the younger people. And the efforts that were made is to say, all right, now we've got liberation, independence, what do we do with it? The efforts that were made, whether right or wrong, tried, this one failed, this one succeeded, they were raising this complaint that among themselves, they've noticed, the older generation, that the youth have not been exposed to this history, which is not good. Because it, among other things, it opens the possibility of the repetition of mistakes that can be avoided. If you are familiar with how these things developed in Tanzania, you'd say, no, things were done, this one was wrong, why do you want to repeat it? So I'm saying that this is for ourselves too. The young people at home, I know, they are very interested in all of these matters. And if I say, our youth is insufficiently educated, it must be about this political and other development. It must be a criticism of myself. Because it's us who have not done the necessary work to impart it. It's not as though the young people, they are deaf or uninterested. It's not true that they are uninterested. But we need other people, these ones who say we were the makers of history. Yes. I think it's our obligation to make sure that the youth is properly education. But that's part of what the foundation is doing via this Democratic Education Trust. So I think that therefore the foundation, I think, should be happy with itself, including this major project that it's undertaking, this presidential center, which includes a library and so on, which Salaam Mbeki, my wife, is the one who led this offensive on this particular one, insisted on it. And you see, it's very interesting that look at the people at home who now say that we are bringing our archives. Our archives should belong here. The current poet laureate, Wallace Rute, is already brought off his material. People like the late Linda Mabuza was also a poet. She's also brought her material here. I don't know when we're going to collect it. Even the Herald, the State Herald, that we inherited from the apartheid system, also his archive is coming to the library. So you get a lot of the South Africans are saying, this is where our material should be. So it's going to be very, very rich in terms of that. It's like to be an exposure to South Africa, not only in terms of its politics, but also in terms of the variety of life, but also, and very important, the rest of the continent. With the archives of Nkrumah there, Kenneth Kaunda, Julius Nyerere, Bob Mugabe. It's a representative of what we should be, Pan-African.
Yeah.
And with this very strong idea that this is not a library in the sense that you go and borrow a book and read it for a week and return it. No. It's a center of engagement among Africans about Africa and its future. That includes the diaspora. So its history must be there. So where do we come from? How did we get to where we are? Where should we be tomorrow? So that kind of center is an African center. And again, that is why you get offers like the late John Garang, leader of the SPLM South Sudan. The people of his archives, they came to the foundation, they say, we want John Garang's archive to be with the foundation. Because they've understood, they've accepted this thing, that this thing, the center, presidential center, never mind this in South Africa, but it's Africa. It belongs to all of us. So that is why even when President Kaunda's family said to us they would like President Kaunda's archive to come to South Africa, I was a bit concerned about that. Because President Kaunda is President Kaunda, father of the nation in Zambia and so on. You can't take all of this and... So I decided, no, we need to consult with President Hichilema. So fortunately, we're in Lusaka, so I saw him and reported to him that to the Kaunda family, this is what they are saying. And as a foundation, we're very happy to do that. But I told President, I need to tell you this, to report this matter to you. So he says to me, please tell the Kaunda children that we are fully in support of this And they must come whatever assistance they need to make sure that this thing is carried out. We'll do it. It was very interesting that the President of the Republic of Zambia would say that about an archive of the father of the nation. That I'm happy that it moves to a library in South Africa, located there, and ready to assist. And indeed, practically, the committee that was established in Zambia to do that, he also put people from his office in that committee, practically to effect this. But it's a statement about the connection of ourselves, South Africa, to the rest of the continent. It affirms this thing that we're trying to argue, that the Africans, as Africans, we share a common destiny, and therefore need to act together to achieve that destiny. And I'm saying that this response, like we get all of these archives from the rest of the continent, is an affirmation of that. So I'm saying that these are some of the things I think that the foundation can be proud about. They're very, very positive. I think that South Africa itself.
You raised in the course of the week, President, about the fracture of African solidarity, Pan-African solidarity, and reflected about the ANC's retreat, as it were, from that project of engagement in the continent, of centering the continent in its own developmental thinking, foreign policy thinking. Not only that, but the fracture of AU institutions, the AU Commission, to coordinate continental effort, united effort. And finally, you reflected about the streets, what one of the students at University of Dar es Salaam called Panaffricanism in the streets. That there used to be these plethora of organizations of the youth, of the workers, of women, outside of the state, of state institutions, in which the project of African solidarity or Pan-Africanism also articulated. I want to ask about that fracture. In what way did it come about? But also in the interest of this library, its location in this South Africa that no longer views itself for many years now as part of this collective thinking in the continent, collective action in the continent. I don't know if I can even be more provocative about that the colonial project actually in its colonizing effort targeted African knowledge. That in this weakness, could you say something then about the strength of the protection of that archive in that part of the continent?
Yes, you see, Mbuyiseni, I think that one of the tragedies that we face as a continent was actually raised at the Africa Day by the panel yesterday, when we had the Africa Day lecture, by one of the panelists there, who ended up by saying he's writing a book on Pan-Africanism and is willing to educate the youth of Africa on Pan-Africanism. Because he was asserting that you not only need good quality leadership. Because remember, he was saying that the part of what's wrong with our leadership is that they eat first and eat too much.
Yes.
And then he also saying they've lost his Pan-African perspective. And he doesn't want the young people to follow that leadership in losing that perspective. And I think it was very much spot on. In a sense, it's a matter that Mwalimu Julius Nyerere raised a long time ago, when he said, yes, indeed, we must struggle for the independence of our countries. But the challenge that arises in that context is that once your country is independent, you got your own government, your parliament, and this and that and the other. It becomes at the cost of the Pan-African perspective. What takes over is the national thing. They here, for instance, in Tanganyika, they argued, this is Tanganyika African National Union, that they needed to hold the independence of Tanzania until other African countries became independent so that together we maintain this kind of cohesion. But Mwalimu raised this thing that we need to be very careful to make sure that the fact of our achieving independence, which we must achieve, does not result in sacrificing the Pan-African perspective. But in reality, I think that's what's happened. In South Africa, in many parts, the rest of the continent, I think the leadership and African leadership in all our countries then get preoccupied with these national issues. And I think in a sense they become overwhelming. And I can just see it, feel it. That right across the continent, we get a progression away from this Pan-Africanist perspective. And people being preoccupied with the people must be preoccupied with national interests and so on, what's happening. But for us as Africans to be together with the rest of the continent, none of us can be truly successful when the rest of the continent is failing. It's all in our selfish interests as countries to make sure that the rest of the continent succeeds. But I'm saying that I think that's part of what has happened. And it's affected the functioning of the continental organization, the African Union. You've got a commission there which is full-time. But you look at practically what it is doing. I'll give you an example of this. There are the challenges in Cameroon that have been going on now for some time, including the violent conflict within Cameroon, kind of civil war. So we've been trying to talk to President Biya about this thing, to say as the African Forum, that's a former heads of state of Africa, to talk to President Biya to say we are ready to assist you, to work with you to solve this conflict. And we haven't gone very far because he's not been very keen to be assisted to address these challenges. So I then talked to, as the Africa Forum were doing this thing, I talked to the Commission of the African Union to say to them, but colleagues, what are you doing about this conflict in Cameroon? So one of the commissioners then tells me that we discussed the matter as a commission and decided that one of us should visit Cameroon to engage the president and everybody to see that what can we do as a union. And she said to me that, and indeed our colleague went. And I was sitting here in Addis Ababa watching the news. And in the news, it showed my colleague arriving in Yaoundé and walked down a red carpet. And she says, President, when I saw my colleague walking down that red carpet, I knew that the mission had failed. So I say, no, this is a puzzling statement to make. He says, it's because the way they arranged that reception was to drive the notion into the head of my colleague that you are a very important person. So you are received with great grandeur. So in the end, it's the visit itself which becomes the objective, not its outcome. So I knew that my colleague would be so happy that he was received so well, and the red carpet and the champagne, this and that and the other. The mission would die. It's a crude reflection of the death of the Pan-Africanist objective. You can't sit there as a full-time functionary of the African Union and you go there to solve a very serious conflict among the Cameroonian people, but you don't carry it out because all that happened, that satisfies you, is that I was given all the necessary protocol and the due and so on. So now I'm a big person. It means there's something that has disappeared in terms of your consciousness and so on. But I'm saying that you see you can see that this general retreat, it's across the continent, including South Africa, away from these African issues, Pan-Africanism, greater concentration on the national to the exclusion of the Pan-African, it impacts on the African Union. Impacts on the African Union in terms of Africa, because that is that ought to be the driver of all of these processes. The African continent, as you know, a lot of disaffection about how the International Criminal Court has treated Africans. You've discriminated against us, you're always targeting us, and all that. And people at the International Criminal Court would say that would like to remind you that the ICC is a court of last resort. It intervenes when your own countries don't prosecute these cases. Either you are unwilling or we have no capacity. As a consequence of that, the continent then decided that what we need to have, that needs to happen, we must establish an African Court of Justice with all of the offenses that are detailed in the Rome Statute, being exactly the crimes that it would prosecute. African Court of Justice. That is an old decision. The protocol was agreed long time ago. Took years and years and years to get that protocol ratified. Because these African countries themselves, which agree, they say, yes, we need that. Now, when it comes practically, now let's give effect to it. A lot of resistance. I checked 2-3 weeks ago, just to check the ratifications. And indeed, the appropriate number of ratifications. And yet, I don't see any steps being taken actually to establish a court. Again, I'm saying this is an example of the weakening of this Pan-Africanist sentiment. Take a correct decision. Let's have the court of first resort, as it were, to try all these crimes against humanity, war crimes and all that. Let's establish it. And good decision. Protocol is done, very well done. Ratification, individual countries then drag their feet. But anyway, fortunately, now the necessary number of ratifications has happened. But action actually to establish the court. There will be many instances of this kind when the Pan-African project will not be advanced as strongly as it should. And I'm saying at the back of it is a retreat from the Pan-African objective to a focus on the national, which is very, very unfortunate. Because apart from anything else, if you look at what is happening globally now, there's huge changes that are taking place in the process of the system of international relations. This insistence on multipolarity is part of that process. Even these discussions about de-dollarization, these are part of that broad discussion. It's exactly at this moment that the African continent should be saying, we as Africans should be saying, in this changing global international order, where does Africa belong? Where do we want to place ourselves? And what do we want to say to the rest of the world to say this is where Africa belongs? You are getting the UN weakened very significantly. The General Secretary Guterres saying that we have to reduce the numbers of people. The UN agencies, same. The funding is getting weaker and weaker. If you lose that multilateral institution, which is the best interests of our continent are served by that multilateral institution. But some of the big powers will say, we'll forget about that thing. We'll go along with the coalition of the willing. And they've got the power to gather the coalition of the willing. We're never part of that coalition of the willing. So these multilateral institutions become our biggest protector, but they're getting weakened. And they have no discussion. No discussion is taking place on the continent as to what does it mean for us? What should we do? And again, I'm saying it's as a result of the weakening of this Pan-African spirit. That level of cohesion in the continent is... So, yeah, it's a challenge. It's a task which not only the foundation, the other foundations, we've agreed here that our foundation will work closely with the Julius Nyerere Foundation on exactly on these sorts of issues. You need that because otherwise the perspectives of African unity and African Renaissance and all of that, those things will recede into the background if we don't correct this movement away from Pan-Africanism. So that matter raised at the Africa Day lecture yesterday by a Tanzanian to say the training of the youth must not only be to say good leadership, but it must also say Pan-Africanist. It's very correct, but that's a major problem.
This domestic, I'd call it, focus itself hasn't quite given the results required.
Sure.
I'm imagining here that two instances. There is, in West Africa, the problem of what are called the Sahel states, but in specifically Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. And so the second problem being, as the developments indicated over the last few days, the DRC and President Kabila's lifting of immunity and the possibility of him being charged. With the first one, President, are we looking at the impossibility, as it were, in that region, West Africa, with these many, many states? Are we looking at the impossibility of democracy? That constantly there's this failure of democracy, at least to constitute a legitimate, credible, reliable political. That there shouldn't be constant resolution or result of any resolution of problems through any other means except democratic consolidation. I wonder that weakness of democracy there, what does it mean? Are we looking at a complete end of the democratic possibility and failure, as it were, for it to give us institutions that are credible on behalf of the people?
Well, I think part of the part of the challenge we're saying, as far as that's concerned, I think is in many instances we ourselves don't understand ourselves. I remember, for instance, a few years back when there was a coup in Mali, and many of us commented negatively about that. Say, but now Mali has had for a long time now no coups. You had this succession of elections and so on, this democracy that you are talking about. And then the Malians would say, you are saying all of that in admiration of Malian democracy because you don't know Mali. Because what has constituted democracy in Mali has been change of power between four families in these years when you are seeing this democracy. It's this rotation of among four families in Mali. It's nothing to do with the people. Incidentally, this issue was raised. I'd hope that all of us South Africans who were at the meeting at the Africa Day lecture yesterday, I hope we reflected on it, because one of the speakers said, the Freedom Charter says the people shall govern. I don't know, he said, I don't know what you South Africans think. You are liberated now. Are the people governing? Is that finding expression in what actually practically is happening in South Africa? Fortunately, we were not asked to answer the question. I don't know how we would have answered. If he had said, please stand up and answer the question, I don't know what we would have said. But I'm saying that, you see, when you're talking about this democracy, is it capable of helping us in terms of solving these problems? I'm saying a first problem is a proper understanding of ourselves. We, in 2004, 2003, 4, 5, thereabouts, were asked by the African Union to help the people of Cote d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast, to solve their problems. And one of the things that I found there is a very thing I didn't know. Many of the Francophone countries had, as they gained independence, they signed agreements with France. An element of that agreement, for instance, in terms of the Cote d'Ivoire, was a joint security agreement. It's an agreement between the two countries that they will protect each other in terms of their security. As a consequence of which, France would have a military base in Abidjan. And the base was there. And the commander of the French troops, if the commander was of the view that the security of these two countries is threatened by whatever, had the power to take over radio and television in Abidjan and decide what happens in protection of that. And it's an agreement, and so we say no. This French garrison here, the commander, he doesn't listen to any president of Cote d'Ivoire. He can take over the country and say, in terms to protect the security of both our countries, I decide as follows. That's what is in the agreement. That's part of the rebellion of the soldiers in Niger, in Sahel, in Ouagadougou. Is against exactly that kind of agreement, that arrangement. Now, I'm saying that sitting away in South Africa there, I then get exposed to this thing that I didn't know. You have the elections that takes place. That's all you can see. But what you don't know is that they take place within the context of continuing French neocolonialism. It's got an objective limitation to it. Even in terms of money, so much of the foreign currency, the foreign currency that you earn must be deposited in the Bank of France, things like that. So I think that's the first thing. I mean, I don't think as Africans, unfortunately, I don't think we give ourselves an opportunity to say, let us understand one another properly. For people, for instance, to say, South Africa, there's great unease across the continent about the way that South Africa has been going for a number of years because of the confidence and trust that people had in South Africa. And then they begin to feel that South Africa is moving away from, just to say on the continent, let's engage in a process, maybe a peer review process, to get to understand the South Africa. That's not happening for often enough. Again, one of the speakers at Africa Day yesterday said he thinks the peer review system is dead. Because it was a very important intervention of this kind to respond to the question that you raised, because it would then intervene in a country to say, it's a democratic country. But what does that mean? How is this democracy functioning? Is it capable of producing these kinds of results? And say it's not, therefore let's do the following. that's very important. So I don't think it's possible to answer the question that you're asking in a general way, because I think it will vary from country to country. But I think the question that was raised legitimately yesterday, when we say the people shall govern, and it didn't stop with South Africa. He said for the rest of the continent, when we say, are the people governing? And what does that mean practically? Does that fact that the people are governing, will it make sure that there's no war, civil war? We'll make sure that there is development. We'll make sure that there's no corruption. Those sorts of questions. The peer review system would answer some of those questions, but it's not happening often enough, and in a sense, too restricted also. It's a peer review system between the peers who are a member of the peer review system with a member state. It's not communicated to the rest of the continent. To say we've reviewed South Africa, whole Africa stop, listen to what we're going to say about South Africa. We've reviewed South Africa and these are our conclusions. So that becomes general African knowledge about South Africa. It's restricted to a closed room. So my own fear is that I think the question that was raised yesterday, when we say the people shall govern, is that actually happening? It's an illegitimate question. And I think in many instances, the answer would be no. People get elected, most probably properly, without crookedness or fraud. But how they behave once they get there it becomes another story.
This Kabila situation, is that, in your reading, going to escalate the fracture and the internal conflict, in particular around M23 and the question of the Banyamulenge? I don't know, because when the government and the Senate in this case then uplifts his immunity with an intention for treason, with already an internal instability, some may conclude that it's a basic escalation of the problem, and we might see total loss of control on the ground. Would that be a correct reading, Mr. President?
When the old man Kabila, Laurent Kabila, took over from Mobutu, we had a discussion with him about, you are now the new president of the Congo. To do what with the Congo? And we said to him that our view was that the revolutionary transition of the Congo from colonialism to liberation that was led by Patrice Lumumba was disrupted deliberately by people who had too much to lose, both within the Congo and globally. It was disrupted, removed from government, murdered. And Laurent Kabila was part of Patrice Lumumba's party. And we said to him that our view was that you are a Lumumbist. And our view is that now we've taken over, let's bring all of the Lumumbists together to say the process of transition was disrupted, interrupted by people who were opposed to the change that revolution was bringing about. Let's go back to that point where it was interrupted in order to resume. Because the Lumumbists understood the Congo very well, the colonial Congo, and said, we're going to build a new Congo different from this colonial Congo. where Congolese colonialism had defined the people, for instance, in terms of tribes and this and that, no. We talk about the United Congo of all of these people. This is Patrice Lumumba's agenda. So we're saying to old man Laurent Kabila, why don't we bring back the other Lumumbis in order to resume that Lumumbist revolution?
Yes.
He dismissed us by saying, actually, there are no Lumumbists to bring together because he's the only Lumumbist remaining. There's no other. So it was a wrong thing because even Patrice Lumumba's deputy, Antoine Gizanga, was still alive, was in Kinshasa, but he didn't want to recognize him as there. But anyway, but the point I really want to make is that, in my view, that's a problem in the Congo. That agenda, which was set by the Congolese Liberation Movement, led by Patrice Lumumba, that agenda has been abandoned by successive generations of leaders in the Congo, including the current ones. You see, for instance, you take Katanga, you remember Katanga, the province of Katanga. And many years ago, Moise Chombe took over and wanted to secede and all that. Was defeated in the end. And Mobutu called it Shaba province. You know what Shaba means in the local language. The Katanga is a copper mining area, lots of copper. And traditionally, the local people worked copper. It's not only during colonial times, it's a traditional. And they would work copper and they do whatever. Shaba means copper shavings. It's what remains after you've and then you've done a statue of copper and then the shavings. That's Shaba. So Mobutu was insulting the Katangese to call the Shaba province. It's a province of the copper shavings. Now, you see, already you are placing in the mind of the Congolese that there are sections of the Congo that are bad Congolese. The notion of a united Congo, Mobutu decides the Banyamulenge that they was talking about at the Africa Day lecture yesterday, who are Rwandan-speaking Congolese in the Eastern Congo. Mobutu decides these are not Congolese, they must go back to Rwanda. Until a militia gets formed, called the Mai Mai, with the sole task to terrorize the Banyamulenge out of the Congo into. Now, that problem of an understanding by the political leadership of the Congo that all of these people are Congolese, whether they live in Katanga or in the Kivus or wherever they live, they belong together. You take the current president of the Congo. They come from the Kasai provinces. And part of what I hear other Congolese complaining about is that he is surrounding himself with people from the Kasai provinces. So you are excluding the rest of the population of the Congo. You are putting around yourself, they saw even in the military appointments, people from the Kasais. You can't, you see, now he sits there, President Tshisekedi, in terms of that allegation. He sits in Kinshasa and says, I'm going to punish that Kabila. Kabila comes from Katanga. You are immediately saying, because of the history of the Congo, we are immediately saying the people of Kasai are opposed to the people of Katanga. You're not going to solve any problem that way. In the same way that any attempt to defeat the Banyamulenge and so on and drive them out is not going to work. These are Congolese, and they are saying we're Congolese. We're not Rwandan. We don't know anything about Rwanda. We speak the same language. And they defend themselves. That's why the M23 gets formed. And indeed, I was, after the M23 took Goma, and then they were moving towards Bukavu, some of the Congolese were saying to me, President, what you should need to know is that the M23 has in fact become the most popular organization throughout the Congo. Because, as I was saying just now, the president is surrounding himself with the people of Kasai, which means the rest of the population of the Congo is against, because it's excluded. And the M23 has emerged as the only force capable of removing Tshisekedi. That is why they are being received with warm hands everywhere on the Congo. Now, I'm saying, Mbuyiseni, that the fundamental problem in the Congo is that you haven't had a leadership with the level of understanding which the liberation leadership under Patrice Lumumba had about what is the Congo, how is it made up, how do you overcome the colonial legacy, what is it that you do? And one of the things you can't do is to perpetuate the tribal, racial, Bantustan divisions that the colonial system imposed. And you continue that, then you'll never find a peaceful Congo. But that's what's been happening. It's wrong. It was wrong really to Joseph Kabila goes back. He's gone back into the Eastern Congo. You say you are removing his impunity and you are going to charge him with treason and all that. It doesn't solve anything. All it does, I'm saying in Joseph Kabila's case, immediately, it will incite the people of Katanga to say you are attacking one of us, therefore we are against you. What are you going to gain from that? Nothing. And the Kivus, the eastern provinces of the Congo, will then say Kabila is with us. Indeed, that is why he himself
is.
When he left South Africa, he told me, he says, I'm going into the Eastern Congo, into the Kivus. And he knew that the people there would welcome him because together they are saying there's something that's wrong in Kinshasa. And if the political leadership of the Congo does not tend to this matter of going back to the Lumumbist agenda, the problems of the Congo won't be solved. They will not, whether it's Banyamulenge or Kabila or whatever. And it's not. The problem does not originate from the neighboring countries, Rwanda, Uganda, and all that. It might be exacerbated by what they do. But the heart of the problem is within the Congo. But how do you get that leadership in the Congo to grasp that, to understand it? This was the Congo that we inherited from Belgium. And this is the Congo that we, the Congolese, want. And therefore, this is what we do.
When Professor Shivu yesterday, President, made another, I think, a devastating statement about we are more dependent as a continent than we were at independence. We're speaking about more than 60 years in some spaces of the continent, some countries. Maybe we can say since the 1950s, but... And I want to canvass then this question on two counts. First one is constant political weakness that invites Western powers or powers outside the continent to take political decisions about local matters, political leadership decisions, who must lead us, this constant meddling, but also this utter disrespect of African leadership. You were speaking about Libya the other day, and would remember there was a delegation of African leaders that was told when they were in a flight going to Libya turn back
Sure.
by powers outside of the continent. That's the first part I want to converse with you. Looking back, the West's not only influence and direct running of the continental programs and decisions, but also just total disregard of the leadership. Are we worse than we were when we attained liberation, or in many instances independence, as Professor Shivu says?
No, I thought that I also heard Professor Shivji say that. And I thought he was correct. Because he was saying the colonial economy was these colonies are the producers of raw materials, and they export them to the colonial mother country and will import. They are a market for the goods produced from there. That structural relationship never changed with independence. It didn't change. So that whereas we're a producer of raw material and mining here in Tanzania and exporting then, in 1960, we continue to do the same. And what then happens is indeed your dependence will increase. Because that colonial power is advancing, is developing. In a sense, you are standing still. You are producing these raw materials as you've continued to do, and you're more and more dependent, and then you run into huge debts. To whom are you indebted? It is a colonial master. So I think he was right. He was saying unless you change the structure and relationship, the dependence will not disappear. So you need to change the structural relationship to say we no longer exporters of raw materials. We do what the Chinese have done. Develop ourselves to become all of whatever colonial dependence China had is disappeared. Because they've changed the nature, the structure of their relations with the rest of the world. That's what Professor Shivji was arguing for. That if we don't do that, we can shout as loud as we want about independence, objectively. Unless you change the structural relationship, the dependence will continue and get worse. He was right. So it's not so much a matter of some politicians sitting in the former colonial power saying, let's do this to them. No. The structural relationship itself dictates.
Invites
Particular kind of behavior. When we were working on what became NEPAD, the Africa Development Program Partnership, we decided to talk to the developed world to say, as a continent, we are working on an Africa Development Program. And when we are done with it, we'd want to make sure that your economic relations with Africa are consistent with what is contained in the Africa Development Plan. One of the things that we did, one of the meetings that we held, it was in Portugal, was with the EU countries, in what they call the European Council, which is a meeting of the heads of government. So we went to that meeting. We requested to speak to them. As I said, they were meeting in Portugal, and we went there to talk to them. Fortunately, before the actual meeting, we meet the president of the council, the president of the European Commission. And he says to us, let me tell you something about the European Council. He's in Italian. He says, the EU has got a policy towards the United States. It's got a policy towards Latin America. It's got a policy towards Asia. It's got a policy towards Eastern Europe and all that. It has no policy towards Africa. You must know that when you talk to them. And the reason it doesn't have any policy towards Africa is because of the assumption and the knowledge among these West Europeans that Africa will always do what they want it to do. So they don't need policy of any kind, because you can always say, Africa do this and the Africans will do it. Don't do this and Africa won't do it. He says that's the attitude of the Europeans. That's why there is no Africa policy in the EU. There's policy about everywhere else in the world except Africa. So we said to him, no, thank you very much. So indeed, when we met them, the heads of government, we say to them, what you must understand, there's a strategic relationship between yourselves and Africa. We're only divided by the Mediterranean. The people across on the continent, you are strategically related to them. And if you continue ill-treating them, it's going to impact negatively on you people. We even raise this immigration thing to say that the longer you help to underdevelop Africa, the more you are driving the African populations into Europe. And you're going to start complaining about that. And therefore, you need to take a different attitude towards the continent. They were to argue that. Fortunately, we had been alerted by the then chair of the European Commission. But as I'm saying, you see what I'm saying, that he was saying the EU has no policy towards Africa because of the structural relationship. That's what Professor Shivji was saying. The structural relationship dictates particular kinds of behavior. So the African continent must do that restructuring. Everybody from South Africa, everywhere, talk about beneficiation of raw materials. Must do it, so that we don't export these raw things. Sure. The amount of electricity it needs. So people make a statement like that. I mean, they were saying not long ago, 3-4 years ago, the Zimbabweans are going to take up this matter about beneficiation of platinum and so on. And I was saying to myself, just talking, because Zimbabwe does not have the electricity. When Kucha, that port, we decided as government they must develop that port and a deep sea and so on and so on. And one of the anchor projects was an aluminium smelter. So we agreed with one of these two major companies, Alcoa, Alcan, one of those two, that they were going to put a plant at Kucha. I smelter, aluminium smelter and all that, in order to then export when we started running into an electricity crisis. And it became clear that because that thing it consumes so much electricity. You can't do the smelting unless you've got electricity. And one of the interesting things, if you've seen, I'm sure you've seen this in Mbuyiseni, the discussion about artificial intelligence, fourth industrial revolution.
Yeah.
All the technology, that it consumes huge volumes of electricity. So if you don't have the electricity like we don't have in South Africa, you say goodbye to that technology. You can't develop it. So those are the structural things that must happen. If the continent wants to say we want to be a leader in terms of modern technologies, like AI, fourth industrial revolution, you must answer the question, where the electricity going to come from?
And it's continental, this electricity.
It's continental.
Yeah.
You've got to answer questions like these are the structural things that Professor Shivji was talking about. One of them spoke about skills. Do we have the skills to be part of this modern world? And what are we doing about that? These structural relations, that's what Professor Shiv was raising, and I think very correctly. And the longer we don't change this structural relationship, the more dependent we will become.
I want to go back, President, to this dependency politically now, because the retreat, as it were, and maybe go to this White House drama over the weekend with the South African president and the president of the United States. Many of us watching that, certainly I think my assessment in the country, it looked like the United States has assumed this position of total disrespect, as it were, to the leadership of our country, characterized by the presumption to think the United States head of state can educate the South African head of state about South Africa and South African problems. It was shocking for us to see the drama even in prepared videos and pictures and all of that. Obviously, we all know it's lies and so on and so forth, but the respect is what seemed to be the bigger thing. We're walking away not understanding how a head of state can relate to another head of state in that manner. But for Africans, with this question of dependency, structural dependency, and many people may argue as well, intellectual as well, it goes deep into the assault of the dignity of our standing as black people in the world, to have seen that drama. The escalation of that deteriorated relationship of South Africa and the United States. President's comment, obviously, in the many moments you have looked at the question, you stop at, in the first term, the relations were this way, of Trump. And then you say you can't quite measure what went wrong. And there are many presidents of the United States over the years, even to people that were not heads of state like O.R. Tambo, that were treated with humongous amounts of respect. Certainly yourself with Bush, during what was a very dramatic international pharmaceutical assault. There still were serious disagreements about HIV and AIDS, but we never saw that. His visit to South Africa, and we never quite, even at the center of key disagreements about the Middle East, Iraq, and all of that, we never saw that drum. There was still a sense of decorum and so on and so forth. I'm saying, with the benefit now of hindsight, the Trump administration has crossed the 100 days. President Ramaphosa has been there with that delegation. What is wrong with that relationship between South Africa and the United States?
It's not, I don't think it's only between South Africa and the United States. You know, the Secretary of State, the current one, Marco Rubio, he did an interview, I think, beginning of February, thereabouts. And he made what I thought was a remarkable statement. He says, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we ended up with a unipolar world where the United States was the boss of everybody. And he says that was irregular. That was not normal. What is more normal is a multipolar world. And he says, you know, in terms of that, and therefore, today, now, we are in a multipolar world. We've moved away from that unipolar, a rare unipolar situation which was unnatural. We're back in a multipolar world. So when I read that, I was saying this is very interesting, coming from Donald Trump's Secretary of State. Then he goes on to say, and in that multipolar world, countries have got their own country interests, and they pursue country interests. And he says, for instance, Chile has got its own interest and it pursues its interest. China has got its interest. Russia has got interest, and blah, blah, blah. Then, of course, he talks about rogue states like Iraq, Iran, and so on. And therefore, the United States also, in this multipolar world, will pursue its own interest. So I said to myself, now I understand what he means. You see, when President Trump spoke America first during the first term, and there was some accusation that from among the Americans that this isolationist is taking America out of the world. It was not true, or not in the least isolationist. He was saying we must be the dominant force in the world. Now, when Marco Rubio says we will pursue our own national interests as every other country does in a multipolar situation, that's what he means. We will define what is in the interest of the United States. They may decide tomorrow that Power FM is owned by the United States and it's in the national interest of the U.S. They'll take that decision and then act to make sure that that happens. And that's what's happening with regard to the rest of the world. They take a particular position. What is in the interest of the United States? That is the only principle that guides us in our foreign international relations. Nothing to do with multilateral or nothing like that. What is in the interest of the United States? Which will be decided exclusively by the United States. And if the United States decides that tomorrow that Thabo Mbeki must die in the national interest, they will act on it. So now, then they will take a position. Here is a South Africa. It's in the national interest of the United States, their view. The defense of Israel must happen. And the disempowerment of the Palestinians, even to the point of their eviction from Gaza and the West Bank and so on, in the national interest of the United States. Now, if you then pop up from somewhere and try and oppose in Israel, you are acting against the national interest of the United States. They take a particular posture, as you know, towards Iran. Iran shall never have nuclear weapons, and therefore we are going to tie them to a particular arrangement. And we have seen that as an accusation that South Africa has been bribed by Iran. So personally, I was puzzled by that. What does it mean? Until I came to understand that what they are arguing is when South Africa says we support the Palestinian people, that's what they say. We actually mean we're supporting Hamas, not the Palestinian people, Hamas. And because we're supporting Hamas, given the relationship between Hamas and Iran, therefore we're on the side of Iran. And the reason we've taken up the Israeli issue in the way that we've done in the International Court of Justice is because we're bribed by Iran in support of Hamas. So that's where the argument comes from, of bribery. South Africa was bribed by Iran. But I'm saying, Mbuyiseni, the posture explained by Marco Rubio, in the context of a multipolar world, the United States will pursue its own national interest, as defined by the United States. So they decide it's in national interest of the United States to have Canada as one of their states.
Yes.
The Panama Canal must be re-owned by the Americans, or Greenland. It's in the national interest of the United States as defined by the United States. I'm saying that impacts on everybody. That was impact on South Africa. I think if we don't understand that, the posture of the United States, and then to be able to respond to it, whatever posture they assume towards South Africa in their national interest, we must be able to stand up to say our own interest is the following, and defend whatever is in our interest, and to debate with them, and perhaps you can persuade them to change what their view is about South Africa. But that's what informs the behavior, not towards only South Africa, but globally, is the pursuit of the national interest, exclusively the pursuit of the interest of the United States, not guided by anything else. If you say to them, no, but you should incorporate in your policy posture the concept and the practice of multilateralism. No. What is that? Only if multilateralism is in the interest of the United States. If not, no. That's how Marco Rubio it. When I read that interview, I understood what Make America Great means. We will pursue American interest and use whatever power we have, whether it's financial or military or whatever, to ensure that the American interest is served. And we'll hit anybody else who wants to stand against that.
Thanks deeply, Mr. President, and happy Africa Day. You certainly do a lot for this Africa Day as a former head of state and as a Pan-Africanist. And thanks for creating time here in Dar es Salaam to speak to us at Power.
But I must say thanks to Power FM
for
sending you here, for Power FM to report this. As you can see, this is a major event for the continent. The Tanzanians will have shown you that, the way they've received us, the way they've handled Africa Day, it's meaning for them as Africans. It's a very important, I'm very, very glad indeed that Power FM could find a way and means and so on to send you here and to get you to report, as you've been reporting. It's really very, very good. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.